You know the questions. Why is it always that spooky stuff? Why don't you ever work on anything nice? You're going to end up attracting weirdos. Well, the joke's on you. I am the weirdo. Those of us who spend our lives thinking about spooky things probably seem fairly alien to most other people. On a certain level, I even understand where those questions come from. If you don't get the horror genre, it's probably hard to understand why those of us who do actually like spending our time on such things. I'm reminded of a meme I saw floating around the internet that said, "Horror fans be like, I need to relax," and then put on a movie where a woman saws off her own head with a piece of piano wire. And it's true. I do like to relax by watching horror movies. In fact, nary an evening goes by that I don't pour myself a drink and unwind with my stories. And those are usually horror stories. But what a lot of people don't seem to understand is that though horror people, and here I include writers, filmmakers, artists, fans, all of them, what they don't understand is that horror people are not nearly as scary as the things we read and write about and watch. It's a topic that's actually come up a few times on the podcast I co-host called Do You Like Scary Movies? And as always, I'll leave a link to that down in the What's It, so be sure to check out all the info I've left for you down there. But we've spoken about this idea on the podcast with several of our guests that the horror people seem, by and large, to be the best people we know. It's true that plenty of us look a little rough around the edges, and it's absolutely true that we spend our time thinking about the most horrible things one can imagine. But the key word there is that we spend our time thinking about those things, not doing those things. It's an intellectual and aesthetic curiosity or attraction, not something we actually think is good. You just don't see the horror fans doing the kinds of things people who don't get it expect us to be doing. And I honestly think a lot of it comes down to simple, morbid curiosity. A couple of times now, I've mentioned a psychological researcher named Colton Scrivener, and I'll also link to his work down in the What's It. But I think his research is beginning to formally document what I think horror fans have intuitively understood for quite a long time. His work started out by measuring morbid curiosity across 4 dimensions: minds of dangerous people, body violations, interpersonal violence, and paranormal danger. And yes, when I took his assessment, my own results buried the needle across all 4 dimensions. That is to say, I scored more than 2 standard deviations above the mean across the board. And that's just because his psychometric instrument lacks the resolution to account for people as extremely morbidly curious as I am. I suspect we're talking about way more than 2 standard deviations here. But we're not really talking about me. What he found is that morbid curiosity seems to be a subset of curiosity in general. That is, the more curious one is, in general terms, the more likely one is to be morbidly curious. But morbid curiosity also fits a Gaussian or normal distribution. That's the familiar bell curve shape that we're all familiar with. So basically, most people would occasionally watch a horror movie. Those are the people in the middle of the distribution. Relatively fewer people inhabit the extremes, which in this case would be those who absolutely refuse to watch horror movies on the one extreme, and on the other extreme, well, basically people like me. But while the morbid curiosity inventory is an interesting new psychometric tool, where things got really interesting for me was when I spoke to Scrivener about some of his work, and he mentioned some fascinating results. Specifically, he found that morbidly curious people tend to score a little bit higher on metrics of so-called dark triad traits. That is, psychopathy, narcissism, and Machiavellianism. At first, Scrivener was as shocked by that as I was when he told me about it, because that seems to play into the very myth we're trying to debunk, the myth that horror people are actually scary kinds of people. But there are two things we need to keep in mind. First, when we talk about slightly higher scores on those metrics, we're still talking about subclinical levels. There is such a thing as a functional psychopath, for instance, and they can be perfectly lovely people and may actually be the best kinds of people for certain kinds of jobs. After all, sometimes you want professionals to be professional and not get emotionally involved in things. There's a difference between having certain psychopathic traits that might be measured on a psychometric instrument and being the kind of psychopath all of us morbidly curious people spend our time reading about in the true crime books. But even more importantly, Scrivener dug into the data and found that the relationship between these traits is actually far more complicated than I think most people understand. Psychopathy itself is subdivided into different psychometric constructs, one of which is called cold-heartedness. It turns out that while morbidly curious people score higher on some of the psychopathic traits, they actually scored low in cold-heartedness. And that is the element of psychopathy that gives all of the negative connotations we think of when we think of psychopathy. We conceptualize psychopaths as people with extraordinarily low empathy. Yet what Scrivener explained is that psychopathy is more complicated than we ever thought. And by we, I mean all of us, including psychologists. Scrivener told me about a study he found that said, in a sample of the general population, about 15% were dark triad people, and another 15% on top of that are what he called dark empaths. Those are people who score high in many dark triad traits, but also score high in empathy. When he reached out to those researchers, he said he thought he had figured out who those people were. They were the morbidly curious people. So morbidly curious people, and horror fans by extension, as there's substantial overlap between these two groups, they aren't evil people. They're actually typically quite empathic people who just happen to have an interest in evil kinds of things. I once went on a date, and somehow the topic came up that I collect morbid and macabre artifacts and oddities. And I mentioned that I own some things that had belonged to some infamous serial killers. In fact, I'll probably make a video about that collection as well, so this might be a good time to remind you to do all those YouTube things like subscribing and ringing the notification bell so you don't miss out on that or any of my other upcoming videos. Anyway, I mentioned this collection, and she was horrified. Well, that doesn't bode well for the prospect of a future relationship, but she asked how I could collect those things. She seemed to think that I must not have any empathy for the victims. But it's exactly the contrary. It is, at least in part, precisely because I have empathy for the victims, that I think it's important that we should preserve these artifacts as reminders of what happened to those people. It's not about celebrating the perpetrators, though I do understand why some people think that it is, but rather it's about remembering their victims. But it's not just that horror people and the morbidly curious are, contrary to unfortunate myth, not unfeeling psychopaths. It turns out that there are actually some mental health benefits to all this crazy, spooky, creepy stuff we do. In my very first video on this channel, I talked from a sort of neo-Jungian perspective about how horror helps train us to deal with the unfortunate things that might happen in our lives. I stand by what I said in that video. And later on, I made a video arguing roughly the same thing from the perspective of Stoic philosophy. Both of those videos are still online, and links will be down in the What's It, so I don't want to belabor the point too much here. But to put it as succinctly as possible, horror gives us the opportunity to experiment and train ourselves for horrifying things in a safe context. So that way we're more prepared to handle them properly when the need might arise. Just like a martial artist trains in a relatively safe sparring match. Some might assume that horror people are just less anxious than others, but Scrivener's work suggests a different interpretation. According to his findings, morbidly curious people actually score low in a construct called stress immunity. That means horror people are no more immune to stress than anyone else. They have just as much stress and anxiety. Rather, it's that their media preferences and psychological profile have helped prepare them to deal with that stress in hopefully more productive ways. There's actually a slight gap here between morbid curiosity and horror fandom, although these are obviously substantially overlapping constructs describing largely overlapping populations. It turns out that horror fans exhibit fewer symptoms of psychological distress in stressful situations, whereas morbidly curious people exhibit stronger positive resilience. That is, when faced with the worst life has to throw at us, horror fans exhibit diminishing negative emotion, whereas morbidly curious people exhibit increasing positive emotion. Those findings came out of another of Scrivener's studies, in which he found that both horror fans and morbidly curious people were more resilient during the worst of the COVID pandemic. It's like playing. When children play, they're not just wasting time. They're learning how the world works. One of the most robust psychological findings of all time is that play deprivation, especially in early childhood, leads to all kinds of horrifying developmental impairments. Of course, the children don't know what they're doing. They don't understand the psychological benefits. They play because it's fun. But in the process, they are developing their motor skills and their coordination. They're learning how to navigate social settings and negotiate for themselves. They're basically learning how to be functional human beings, capable of navigating the world. Adults need play too, and horror is a kind of play for adults. It provides a safe context in which we can rehearse the horrible things that can and will happen in all of our lives. And by playing it out through fiction, we develop some of the resources we need to deal with real-life stressors. When I recently spoke on the Do You Like Scary Movies podcast with Dr. Stephen Schlossman, psychiatrist and author of The Zombie Autopsies, the same ideas came up. Even very serious people studying infectious disease are more than happy to drop their work to play with ideas of the zombie virus, because within that play we can learn a lot of things. Hell, when I was earning my math degree, I even used to practice my differential equations by trying to mathematically model the zombie apocalypse. And it's not just abstract. There are even potential therapeutic applications of this kind of thing. A Dutch research group developed a horror-themed neurofeedback game called Mindlight. What that basically means is that while playing the game, participants, in this case they were children, are hooked up to a brain-scanning device. During the game, they have to confront scary stimuli, and in order to successfully navigate the game, they have to remain calm. According to the research, training with this game performs as well as cognitive behavioral therapy, or CBT, in reducing certain symptoms of anxiety. Given that CBT is often considered the gold standard in anxiety treatment, this is quite an important finding, and I'm looking forward to a lot more research along those lines. The way Scrivener explained it to me is that horror can provide an exit path for rumination. One of the good and bad things about the human mind is that it's very difficult for us to attend to more than one thing at a time. Turns out, people who claim to be expert multitaskers are very often overestimating their own abilities. But that's neither here nor there. What's important is that it's nearly impossible to be anxious about more than one thing at a time. If you watch a horror movie, you might still be anxious, but if you're really attending to the film, you're replacing your real-life anxiety with the fictional one. And because you do know that it's just fiction, you can keep that anxiety under control. So the idea is that you can use horror to localize your anxiety to a safe and controllable context wherein you can manage it more effectively. So yeah, horror people like creepy things. But we're not creepy people. Not in the sense of being really creepy, like we might do something harmful to anyone. In fact, even beyond all the psychological stuff we've been talking about, I just have to say that horror people are often the kindest and most approachable people in the world. When I attend a horror conference or convention, everyone there is almost invariably friendly and welcoming, not only to industry veterans, but even to the newcomers. Maybe it's because of some of these psychological ideas, or maybe it's just that horror people know we are the outcasts of the literary and cinematic world, and so we kind of stick together. Whatever the case, no, horror people aren't necessarily scary. They're the best people you're likely to ever meet. And as we come to the end of another video, briefer than many of my previous videos, do be sure to like, subscribe, and leave me a comment. And while you're at it, go ahead and share this video with your friends the next time they ask why you like all that creepy stuff. And until next time, take care and stay scared.